In 1920, bourbon production fell by 70%. Thousands of distilleries went dark. An entire American industry was, effectively, erased. Yet one whiskey never stopped being sold legally while the country went dry. Not through bootlegging or backroom deals, but through a federal permit, a pharmaceutical loophole, and choices made half a century before anyone saw Prohibition coming. George Garvin Brown arrived in Louisville in 1870 with a pharmacist's eye for detail and a salesman's instinct for trust. At a time when whiskey was usually sold by the barrel, Brown insisted on bottling his bourbon in sealed glass bottles. This was more than packaging. In an era of rampant adulteration, when spirits were cut with everything from prune juice to turpentine, a tamper-proof seal was a public promise. Brown's advertisements called Old Forester the only bourbon in a sealed bottle, linking purity to the kind of reliability physicians expected from medicine. Each bottle carried his handwritten guarantee, a gesture borrowed from the world of pharmaceutical remedies, not barroom whiskey. This approach did not just set Old Forester apart on the shelf. It built a record of credibility that would matter decades later, when the government began to scrutinize who could be trusted with a medicinal whiskey permit. Brown's early decision to use sealed bottles to emphasize consistency and safety created a paper trail of integrity. The brand's reputation was not an accident of marketing, but the result of methodical choices that made Old Forester eligible for federal trust when Prohibition arrived. While others scrambled to adapt, Brown's company already spoke the language of legitimacy. In the years before the law changed, Old Forester's identity as a whiskey you could trust was quietly written into every bottle that left the bottling line. That foundation would soon become the difference between survival and extinction. In January 1920, the 18th Amendment did more than outlaw whiskey. It detonated the entire American bourbon industry. Kentucky alone had produced nearly 200 million proof gallons of bourbon the year before. Within 2 years, that output collapsed by 70%. The price of an empty oak barrel, a mainstay of the business, fell by almost half as distilleries shuttered and warehouses emptied. More than 2/3 of Kentucky's distillery workforce lost their jobs, shrinking from 12,000 to fewer than 4,500 by 1924. The numbers tell only part of the story. Once familiar names like Wild Turkey and Taylor vanished from the market, forced to sell off assets or dissolve entirely. Jim Beam, unable to secure a medicinal permit, turned to clandestine runs across state lines, risking raids and asset seizures. Heaven Hill went dormant, its barrels aging in the dark, while Four Roses clung to a limited medicinal license before being absorbed by larger conglomerates. For most, the choice was stark: shut down, go underground, or disappear. The medicinal whiskey loophole offered only a narrow escape, available to a handful of companies that could prove their trustworthiness to federal inspectors. For the rest, Prohibition was an extinction event, a sudden erasure of brands, jobs, and the old ways of doing business. In this bleak new landscape, the simple act of staying legal became a rare and improbable advantage, one that would set Old Forester apart from nearly every rival. Permit P3 was more than a slip of paper. It was the official stamp that separated Old Forester from a vanished world of shuttered warehouses and silent stills. In April 1919, the Commissioner of Internal Revenue signed off on Brown-Forman's application, authorizing the company to manufacture, store, and sell up to 5,000 proof gallons of 100 proof medicinal whiskey per quarter. The government's approval came with strict conditions: 1-pint bottles only, each sealed and labeled for medicinal use, and every transaction tied to a physician's prescription. Internal Revenue inspectors arrived quarterly, checking barrel inventories, verifying bottling line integrity, and reviewing sales ledgers for signs of diversion or fraud. The production cap, 2,500 gallons per month, was an iron ceiling enforced by mandatory reports and tax payments logged in the federal excise ledger. Every 3 months, Brown-Forman filed Form IR-12Q, listing proof gallons produced, taxes remitted, and sales to licensed pharmacies. Inspection reports from June 1922 and November 1925 note uninterrupted operations and full compliance. No other Kentucky bourbon house held a permit with this level of scrutiny or renewal regularity. When stocks ran low in 1929, Brown-Forman's record of compliance earned a special amendment. The commissioner raised the quarterly cap to 12,000 proof gallons, but only for permit P3. No other distillery received such latitude. The paperwork was relentless, but it was also a shield. While the industry around it was dismantled or forced underground, Old Forester's survival rested on the discipline of forms, ledgers, and quarterly inspections. The brand's legal status was never an accident. It was the product of a system that demanded constant proof, not just of whiskey, but of trust. Inside the bottling hall, Old Forester's daily reality was shaped by rules that few whiskey makers would have chosen. The federal mandate was absolute. Every medicinal bottle had to be filled at 100 proof, no exceptions. That higher alcohol content was intended to prevent tampering and simplify tax calculations. But it also changed the whiskey itself, making the spirit hotter, bolder, and less forgiving of mistakes. The company's old mash bill was roughly 75% corn, 15% rye, and 10% malted barley, a starting point, not a guarantee. As barrels from shuttered rivals came up for sale, Brown-Forman bought them in bulk, blending these orphan casks into its own inventory to keep the line running. Warehouse A ledgers from the mid-1920s show a rolling mix of house-made and acquired stock, each entry tracked by hand. The result was a whiskey that could shift from batch to batch, sometimes heavier with oak and caramel from an older barrel, sometimes spicier or sharper depending on the blend. A 1924 internal memo summarized the output: 2,200 gallons per month, just enough to meet the government's ceiling and keep the bottling crew on payroll. For the workers, continuity meant steady wages in an industry where most jobs had vanished. For drinkers, the taste of Old Forester became both familiar and unpredictable, a whiskey shaped as much by legal constraint as by recipe. The company's survival depended on these compromises: stay within the lines, adapt to the proof, and keep the barrels coming, even if each bottle carried the subtle signature of a market remade by law. With the ink barely dry on the 21st Amendment, Brown-Forman moved faster than the competition. Years of meticulous compliance had left warehouses stocked with barrels, some aged 12 years or more, while rivals faced empty ricks and broken supply chains. Old Forester's medicinal bottling lines, once restricted to the pharmacy trade, switched overnight to commercial production. What had been a lifeline for doctors and patients became a springboard for mass distribution. Within weeks, the company converted nearly 1,800 pharmacy-linked accounts into wholesale distributors, flipping a regulated network into a retail engine. A nationwide print blitz announced the only bourbon that never stopped, staking a claim no competitor could match. As others scrambled to rebuild, Old Forester's aged whiskey hit store shelves, backed by a promise of continuity and trust. The dividends of legality were not just measured in bottles sold, but in the speed and scale of a return that reshaped the post-Prohibition market. On today's shelves, Old Forester's story is bottled in two modern releases: the Prohibition-style 1920 and the 10-year 1924. Each label is more than a nod to history. It is an argument for authenticity, built on the claim that this bourbon never left the legal market. The 1920, bottled at 100 proof, mirrors the medicinal standard enforced during the dry years, while the 1924 draws on the 10-year age statement to evoke barrels acquired and preserved when most of the industry vanished. These expressions are not just collector's items. They are artifacts of a brand that uses its continuity as proof of legitimacy. For drinkers who seek more than flavor, who want a link to the American past, the presence of these bottles signals a line unbroken by repeal, reform, or reinvention. Old Forester's survival is no longer just a story. It is poured, measured, and tasted in the present. Legitimacy, not nostalgia, forged Old Forester's place in American whiskey. Its survival meant adapting within the unnatural confines of Prohibition law, a contradiction that echoes now as the brand's everyday presence carries the weight of unbroken history. Sometimes, the strongest legacy is simply never having disappeared.